Hello and welcome. My name is Morgan and this channel is storytelling of the disturbing, mysterious and supernatural. So if this kind of content is your thing, then don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for weekly videos. But for now, grab a cup of tea and get comfortable as we get into today's video. Cults. Probably not the first thing that springs to mind when you think of Australia, right? The country's had its fair share of notorious killers, yes, but cults not so much. And this case is intense. It's disgusting, but the final outcome is going to make you seriously angry. We're talking about one seriously depraved woman who thought she was the reincarnation of Christ. Yep, here we go. And amassed a following of nearly 500 members while stealing up to 28 children and locking them away from the world before it all unraveled. And I cannot emphasize enough the power this woman had over her followers. She made people do pretty much anything she wanted, and I mean anything. And I do want to put a caution out on this video as we will be talking about severe child abuse, stolen babies, extreme drug use, fraud, brainwashing, suicide, black magic. It's a lot to unpack, so yeah, buckle up. How does she do it and why? Unseen, unheard, unknown. That was this cult's motto. We're looking into the grim history of The Family, Australia's biggest cult, and the woman behind it all, who was the master puppeteer who played everyone until the very end.
Start to take in the children.
I love children.
I love children. Those were the words that Anne Hamilton Byrne used when she was asked why she started Australia's most notorious cult. But as you'll understand as we delve into this disturbing case, is that Anne clearly had no love for children and very clearly no soul for what she would inflict on everyone that she came into contact with. So first of all, Anne was actually born Evelyn Grace Victoria Edwards on December the 30th, 1921 in Sale, Victoria, which is a town 2.5 hours drive from Melbourne. And so we don't get confused, I'll refer to her as Anne moving forward because yes, she did change her name. She was the oldest of 7 children. Her father, Ralph Edwards, was born in a Melbourne suburb and during his 20s fought in World War I, before returning and marrying Anne's mother, Florence Hoyle, who originally came from London. Now, Florence claimed to be a psychic and medium who could communicate with the dead. However, she was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and was hospitalised in 4 different mental health institutions in Melbourne during 1941. With her mother in and out of mental institutions and a largely absent father, Anne didn't have a nice upbringing and spent much of her childhood in orphanages. By the time Anne was 20, she married her first husband Lionel Harris in 1941, and they had their first child together, Judith. He joined the military but soon after was posted interstate and then disappeared for nearly 8 months and was eventually arrested by military police after being found with his wife Anne in Victoria. So he then applied to leave the Air Force 10 years after Judith was born because he was worried about Anne's mental health. He said she was very abnormal to her child and her behaviour was very strange. So there's our first big red flag. An official diagnosis was also made by Anne's doctor and noted that she was depressed and neglecting Judith. And he feared that she had inherited her mother's instability. Now, I would say if her husband was worried about her and the doctors saying that, then it would seem like she did have some sort of mental illness. Not that I'm a doctor, but it sounds like it to me. Lionel stayed in the military for another year, but then was discharged on compassionate grounds, which I'm guessing is to do with her mental health, and maybe he feared for their daughter, who knows. After leaving the Air Force, Lionel became a car salesman. However, he was killed when he was just 33 when 2 cars collided at an intersection. He had actually been on his way to pick up a baby boy from Bernardo Homes to adopt with Anne, and he left behind Anne's only daughter Judith, who would later change her name to Natasha. In 1955, a single woman couldn't legally adopt a child, so Anne's dreams of having a bigger family were taken away. Now, I'm confused as if her husband Lionel was already worried about her behaviour towards their first child, then why would he agree to adopting another? However, we don't have the facts as to how she acted after he left the military, like maybe he felt she improved or just wanted to please her. We don't know, but it doesn't sound like the smartest thing to do. However, as we will move on, you will see that Anne was extremely manipulative, so I'm guessing she would have had this power over him as well. After Lionel's death, Anne, who at the time was still Evelyn, went for cosmetic surgery, elocution lessons, and changed her name to Anne Hamilton, a completely new identity for her to start a whole new life. During the 1960s hippie movement, Melbourne saw a massive boom in the yoga space and Eastern mysticism. So Anne started training at the Gita School of Yoga in Melbourne under Margaret Sigismund. She then became a yoga teacher herself and started teaching, gathering a following in the community, particularly with wealthy middle-aged women. She introduced herself as a physiotherapist, a nurse, and that she had a Tibetan guru. Of course, none of these claims could be proven, and she may have borrowed the story about having a Tibetan guru from Margaret Sigismund, who she'd actually trained under. She did seem to have this spiritual power over people though, and at the Sigismund's yoga school, she once cast a spell on a young man from one of the classes who didn't agree with her. Going into the kitchen, she muttered, "He's not going to be here tomorrow. He's going to be very sick." The next day, he didn't turn up with that exact reason, and the incident caused Margaret Sigismund to actually cut ties with Anne. So clearly Anne's got some ideas up her sleeve, and she's wanting someone with power and influence, someone she could potentially control perhaps. She decided to choose Dr. Rayner Johnson. Just before Christmas in 1962, Anne visited the study of Dr. Rayner Johnson at the University of Queen's College, Melbourne. The two had never actually met before. Anne just turned up unannounced to convince him she was a spiritual being who could see into the future. Dr. Johnson was born in England, but his religious background led him to work in Australia. Now, he was more of an academic, however, in his later years he became very interested in the spiritual world and even had published several books on mysticism and psychic research during the 1950s and 60s. He recorded in his manifesto that a young lady of perhaps 30 to 35 years of age, of fair hair and complexion, of medium to slender build, of clear grey sparkling eyes and a quiet attractive voice addressed me. Anne at that time was in fact 41, however had had a facelift, so probably looked younger than her actual age. She said to him, "I don't think you know me, but I know you well. My name is Anne." After inviting her in and letting her sit, she proceeded to tell him, "I understand you are shortly going on a trip to India." Dr. Johnson was in fact going on a 6-week trip to India with his wife Mary to travel and lecture. How did Anne know this? Well, no, she wasn't in fact psychic like she had him believe, but she did have a knack at finding out information about people secretly. And there were a couple of men at the college that she was said to have known well and that could have had been feeding her this information. One of these was John Champenus, a psychologist and friend or possibly boyfriend of Anne's. The other was Michael Riley, a South African ex-naval officer who would become his second husband in 1965, although the marriage only lasted a year. Michael Riley was in charge of catering and gardening at Queen's University, and him and Dr. Johnson were friendly, so access and information about Dr. Johnson and what he was going to be doing wouldn't have been that difficult. Dr. Johnson was deep into transcendence and the paranormal. A former student of his described him as perfectly cast for the role in the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland, and that he had a disproportionately large head, somewhat like an egg turned upside down, which is a good description, I think. Anne told Dr. Johnson that many people would be interested in his visit, and cautioned that his wife Mary's health would be in danger, saying that she might die from eating fish, and would have to come back to Melbourne earlier than planned, and that if she didn't die, she would be sick for quite a while and not herself. So what happened? They went to India and Mary got acute dysentery, which is a gastrointestinal disease, had to cut the trip short and was pretty sick and wasn't herself for quite some time after. Now, India is well known for getting sick as a Westerner, so it's definitely not a leap to make a statement like this. However, this event really marked Anne's power over Dr. Johnson, as he truly believed she was clairvoyant. He was also a crucial foothold in building the cult she would head, using the influence of his name and contacts. He wrote in his diary, "It is scarcely necessary to say that upon our return in February 1963, the person we were most looking forward to seeing again was Anne." And after this, weekly visits between their homes were made. Anne's plan had worked, and she started grooming Johnson. Ian Weeks, Johnson's former student, the one who said that Johnson had a head like an upturned egg, said that Johnson's spiritualism had led him to believe that he had been invited by a college of spirits to widen spiritual beliefs within the world. And spiritualism was quite widespread at that time, particularly in the upper middle classes, where it was common that if you had a dinner party, afterwards you would have coffee, port, and bring out the Ouija board and try and connect with spirits. Anne confided in Johnson, telling him of her late husband who had died in a car accident. That bit was true. And that she had lost 3 children, a total lie, and had contemplated suicide, and we don't know about that bit. She also told him about her guru that she had. In May of 1963, Anne's biological daughter Judith, from her late marriage to Lionel Harris, was also involved in a car accident, rolling her car, fracturing her skull, and wounding her eye. Doctors told her that she might actually lose her sight. Johnson wrote in his diary, her mother immediately organised spirit help. Judith did leave the hospital a week later, much earlier than anticipated. I think this is the most Christ-like person I have ever met, wrote Johnson. So right now, Anne's doing a very good job of pulling the wool over his eyes. And to boot, she's proclaimed herself as his post-retirement teacher, telling him to slow down his activities, avoid food for 2 days a week, etc. A year later in 1964, Dr. Rayner Johnson buys land at Ferny Creek, just about 40 minutes outside of Melbourne, and builds Santa Keaton Lodge, which would become the headquarters of what was called the Great White Brotherhood and later renamed the Family. Anne led a religious and philosophical discussion group there, meeting each Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday. The weekly meetings included Anne delivering a mishmash of Hindu, Buddhism, and Christian messages to her followers. She literally believed that she was Christ reincarnated in female form, and brainwashed her followers to think the same. Now, the group consisted of middle-class professionals, nurses, and psychiatrists that were recruited by Johnson and Anne, which I think is kind of crazy because we're talking about intelligent people here who blindly followed Anne and believed everything she was saying and did all of her bidding for her. Like, as a psychiatrist, how could you not see that she was most probably mentally ill? Or consider, hey, this woman thinks she's Jesus Christ. Maybe this isn't legit, let's get out. And you're probably thinking, well, how does she do this then? Well, one of her members was Marion Villemick, who managed New Haven Hospital, a private psychiatric hospital which treated many of its patients with LSD. Now, at the time, the drug was legal at New Haven because the Victorian Health Department had actually legalised it. Most cult members on joining the group were taken to New Haven Psychiatric Hospital and given LSD or psilocybin. And this next bit. While under the influence of these drugs, Anne would appear in the doorway, dressed in white robes and with a dry ice machine behind her. These theatrics actually made her followers think she was holy because, let's face it, if you're on psychedelics, then, well, like, anything's possible. On coming out of their trip, they would truly believe she was Jesus Christ. Also, during the 1950s and 60s, medical and military were experimenting with the use of LSD as a truth serum. Psychiatrists in the group would have told Anne about this and its potential to get deep into the minds of their followers. And this is exactly what she did, finding out information and secrets that no one else knew. And of course, having access to this knowledge then meant she could use it against them when it suited her to destroy marriages and relationships or to get them to do whatever she wanted. But what would happen if members decided they didn't want to be a part of the sect anymore, or didn't want to do certain things for her? Well, this is where it gets more sinister. Members would be given electroshock treatment and threatened with being admitted to New Haven for years if they didn't comply with Anne. She would remind them that it only took 2 psychiatrists to admit them, and of course she had a whole bunch of psychiatrists to hand who would do her bidding. Anne also took LSD herself, and at one point under the influence, she had a vision that she needed to adopt dozens of children to save them from some upcoming apocalypse that she believed was going to happen at some point. And what started as an already crazy religious sect was about to get a whole lot worse. She then met a man by the name of Bill Byrne, a wealthy man who had an earth-moving business. Now, Bill was already married with a wife, May Byrne, and 4 children of his own, but that didn't stop Anne. Bill's wife, of course, was not having it and put up a fight against Anne, trying to steal her husband. So what does Anne do? She gets his wife, May, admitted to New Haven Psychiatric Hospital. She sticks her on drugs and with no knowledge to May of when she'll actually get let out. At one point, Anne even enters May's room at the hospital and said, "May, you might as well face it. He's mine now, not yours." Now, aside from being seriously messed up, I have so many questions here. Like, why would Bill let Anne stick his wife in a psych unit? Why would he go out with this crazy woman, and why would he leave his children? Because after this event, there's no evidence he stayed in contact with them either. He literally just left his whole family to be with Anne, just like that. Anne and Bill, who she would later marry becoming Hamilton Byrne, started adopting or stealing children in 1968. Between this time and 1975, 14 infants and young children had been acquired. Some of these were biological children of members of the family who had been brainwashed to willingly hand over their children to Anne. One such woman was Joy Travlin, the mother of Ben Shenton. Now, Joy came from a well-respected Jewish family in Melbourne, although she went to a Christian school when she was younger and then found the two religions difficult to process, so sought answers from an early age. She married young to a man Ben Shenton says had issues and was left to raise 3 sons with little support. In the early part of the 1960s, she was also involved in a car accident that gave her severe whiplash. Conventional medicine failed to help her pain, and she was advised to try yoga. Her mother just so happened to already practice yoga where Anne was teaching, and this is how they came to meet. By 1964, Joy was trapped in a failing marriage and bedridden due to her neck pain, with none of the specialists in Melbourne being able to help her. But the day before Joy was to go into hospital for exploratory surgery, Anne came to her house and told her if she was willing to follow her, she would heal her. Bold claims, yes? Anne was clearly extremely confident in what she could promise, and that kind of confidence, if then pulled off, can get you very far. Now, she had experience in this kind of healing with her daughter's past car accident, so Joy agreed and Anne put her in prayers and light. Within 6 weeks, Joy was up and walking, convincing Joy that Anne was the real deal. Along with this miraculous healing power and the literature that Anne had given Joy to read, Joy soon became convinced that Anne was in fact the reincarnation of Christ. She moved into the family compound, and her son Ben Shenton was renamed Benjamin Sal Hamilton Byrne, and Joy became Naomi Hamilton Byrne, one of his many aunts. Other children were obtained using lawyers, social workers, and doctors, all within the sect, of course, forging birth certificates and avoiding official channels. All these children took the name Hamilton Byrne, and the adult members of the group became aunties and uncles who looked after the children. I say looked after because it was definitely anything but. All the children were told that Anne was their biological mother, and were led to believe that all the other children were, in fact, their biological brothers and sisters. They were given identical matching outfits. They had their hair dyed peroxide blonde to all look alike, and to give the appearance that they were one of the same family. Anne told the children she came from royalty, that she knew and had had tea with the Queen, that she was an opera singer, and that all the children were descended from the house of David, which was Jesus' bloodline. Just lies upon lies. On top of all this, Anne squeezed as much money out of her members as she could. Aunties had to actually pay for the privilege of working for her looking after the children. She charged for yoga lessons, she charged for meditations, and even collected 10% of her followers' income, meaning that she ended up being extremely rich, especially considering that these members were all wealthy professionals. She was ambitious and wanted to expand the cult and bought several properties in Australia, England, and the US. I think it's hard to get your head around why these people followed her, doing her bidding, but Anne was extremely charismatic and clearly had this unnatural hold over people. She would change her appearance with cosmetic surgery, drive Jaguars, and wear expensive clothes. She apparently courted women with her mind and men with her body. And she loved to prey on those with emotional vulnerability. She told members exactly who to marry, who to leave, and even who to have a baby with. Like, they probably would have jumped off a cliff if she told them to do that. The children were kept in seclusion and homeschooled at Kailama, also known as Utop, another property that the cult owned, which was at Taylor Bay on Lake Eildon, around 3 hours east of Melbourne. Anne struck a deal with the Victorian Education Department early on, meaning that she actually registered the family as a school and essentially cut off all contact from the outside world. And cut off contact she did. These children were literally hidden away from the world. A district inspector of schools in August 1983 actually filed a report on the school that read, "Manners, speech and general deportment are beyond reproach. There was no evidence of dogma, rigid programming, or indoctrination." Between 1968 and 1987, 28 children would make up the family. Unfortunately, these children led a far from happy and normal childhood. They suffered extreme physical and mental abuse by the cult members, who were called the aunties. Starved, sometimes for days on end, they would be beaten for not being obedient or for wetting the bed. They were given a large cocktail of drugs to keep them docile. They were body shamed, hit with canes and shoes, and held in water to the point of almost drowning, or until they confessed to something they did or didn't do. One boy was even nicknamed Zebra Stripes because of the almost permanent bruises he had from wetting the bed every night and being beaten because of it. Although mainly the aunties would dole out punishment and beatings at Anne's request, especially if they were overseas in either the UK or the US, which they often were, Anne and Bill, of course, would also be part of it when they were at the commune. On one occasion, Bill Byrne beat one of the girls, Leanne. She was thrashed with a belt buckle, and the other children just had to watch on in horror. Drugs were a massive driving force within the sect, not only to brainwash the members, but also the children. One of the children was given psilocybin and a healing by one of the uncles. He would later make a statement to the police, but was too ashamed to disclose the fact that he had actually been sexually assaulted. Other children would also make similar claims. At 14 years old, they would be given large doses of LSD in a weird initiation ceremony. They were left alone in a room, told to work on themselves, to confess that they were evil, that they had sexual thoughts, and were told by Anne that she was the reincarnation of Christ. One of the children, Sarah, had been taken to England in 1984 when she was just 15. Anne locked her in a guest bedroom and gave her massive doses of LSD every 12 hours for a couple of weeks. I don't even know what that would do to your mental health, long term. The children's daily routine consisted of hatha yoga and meditation at 5:30 a.m, followed by setting up the boys' room for school. Beds would be moved away, the blackboard would come out, the school books would come out, a plate of vegetables for lunch, another for dinner. School finished at 4 p.m, then shower, more yoga, meditation, dinner, homework, reading, and finally bed. All of this on repeat for 52 weeks of the year. Ben Shenton, one of the children of the family, said that Anne would discourage friendships between the children, noticing any close relationships that formed and quickly separating those individuals. They were sheltered from any media coverage, and the one freedom they did have was access to a library. Ben would read about World War II and concentration camps, and started to draw parallels between that and his own life within the family. He says they didn't leave the compound, had to be secretive, and that they couldn't go anywhere without a chaperone. Anne once allowed the older girls to attend a dance class, and on returning, they told the other children about students from a nearby school and of sleepovers and of other children's activities. They suddenly became aware of how different their lives were. Ben says that he was about 10 years old, and then they began to refer to the compound in which they lived as the concentration camp. The cult lived by their motto of unseen, unheard, unknown, and that Anne was doing secret work once passed down by an enlightened master that society wasn't ready to accept. This need for privacy meant that the compound they were in was perfectly located, with the lake bordering 3 sides of it, and further security included barbed wire fences and big brown gates that detailed trespassers would be prosecuted. Anne also created this weird construct that she was pregnant, maybe to try and legitimize to others that the children were her own, or maybe just for her own sick fantasy. But former sect member Margaret Brown told of having to make Anne's pregnancy clothes for her. She said she seemed to be pregnant all the time. Of course, she wasn't pregnant, but she was crazy enough to be pretending to be, and telling everyone that some of those children were actually her biological children. I think in the end she claimed that 9 out of the 28 children were actually biologically hers. And how did people not know that she wasn't pregnant? because she would have had to actually have the baby for a start. Or maybe they did know and they just didn't dare cross her, but either way, it's pretty messed up. Despite weirdly pretending she was pregnant all the time, Anne actually treated pregnant women extremely badly. A former sect member, Barbara Kibbe, had fallen pregnant while within the group. Anne denied her any visitors and she fell into a deep depression, became very thin and couldn't think properly. Anne told her she was a mess and took away her 2 children and sent Barbara to England for a year while the children went to Kailama. However, the results were catastrophic. Her son David was so badly treated, he was given back to Barbara when he was just 7 years old, telling her if he stayed up there he would have died. When she got him back, he actually lost the ability to speak. Her other son Matthew became so depressed he tried to take his own life when he was just 16, and sadly when he was 20 he succeeded. One year, Anne and her entourage of identically dressed children went to meet Swami Muktananda, at the time the yogi head of a multi-millionaire empire. Swami was based in India, however travelled the world building one of the biggest spiritual followings that also consisted of quite a few celebrities. So we're talking about quite a glamorous following here. A former devotee of Swami, Joan Raha Bridges, said that one time the family showed up. They stayed at their sect property in Holyville and visited the ashram every afternoon, showing off the children to Swami's clan, perhaps hoping that some of his followers might transfer to her. Joan said that Anne was jealous of Swami, being that she believed that she was the Messiah. However, his influence and power clearly outranked hers. Swami gave Anne the name of My Yoga Shakti, which means the Great Mother. However, this was more likely to make a joke out of her. Joan says that Swami practiced black magic and she believes that Anne was there to learn from him. One of the children said that Anne would put names of police officers or people that she wanted to get rid of on a piece of paper into an ice cube tray, fill it with water and then freeze it. When asked in an interview what would happen, she told of those people falling ill. Fran Parker, another former sect member, said that once a young man who disagreed with Anne was told by her that he had turned away from the light and that he would die of a heart attack. He went home and that exact thing happened. By this time, several negative news articles and TV interviews had been made about the cult. Anne and Bill were frequently on the move. Any time the family would hit the news in Australia, they would move to the UK or the US in an attempt to escape the prying eyes of media outlets. When they came back from their travels, a lot of filming would take place with the children, perhaps as propaganda to recruit more people into their cult for their planned expansion. Mary Moore, an investigative journalist for Channel 9, actually visited the commune in 1985 after hearing claims children were kept on the property. However, her suspicions were ignored. The visitors called, the aunties made sure that the children were hidden until the visitors left, telling the children that they would be taken away in sacks and beaten if they were found. And of course given the illusion that there weren't any children kept on the property. Mari said that many of the members apparently didn't know what was going on with the children or what was happening to them, as they were also kept in isolation for what was going on. Only the special aunties or uncles who raised the children actually knew. Despite several local police visits and a growing number of negative media reports on the family, no action had actually been taken by law enforcement. However, in 1987, that was about to change as things started to totally unravel for the group. One of the children, Leanne, who I mentioned before that was being beaten by Bill, made her second escape attempt in 1986. Now, her first attempt was met with the police returning her, which I can't imagine what the punishment she would have received for that would have been. But luckily the second attempt was made when she was 17 years old. Running as fast as she could to a neighbouring property, she had the homeowners call the police, and this time they couldn't force her to go back. One of the other children raised in the compound, 17-year-old Sarah Hamilton Byrne, had also been previously expelled from the group for arguing and acting rebellious. She was taken in by another family and introduced to a private investigator who had been investigating the family for several years. Along with Sarah and Leanne's help talking to the police and Child Protective Services, this finally led to the raid on the property on August 14, 1987. The Victorian federal and local police stormed the compound and rescued the remaining children. Leanne, feeling guilty that she had left the other children, decided to enter the house along with the police to show them that she was safe and to hopefully make the other children feel less scared. At one point, though, during the rescue, Bill confronted her on the stairs and screamed that she was a traitor. Because of the lies the children had been told about the police wanting to harm them, they actually tried to fight off their rescuers, fighting and screaming as they had no idea that their lives weren't normal and no idea what was happening, thinking that they were about to be killed. In early December of the same year, Lex DeMann, a sergeant who would be integral to the case, was called out to attend a fire at a school near Ferny Creek. There was a student in the school, Roland Whitaker, a former child of the cult, who had been told to leave the commune because he was too rebellious. The local senior constable said to Lex that the child's parents were tied up with a religious sect. That was the first time that he had heard about the family. The constable told Lex not to get involved and that if he did, it would be with him for life. And he was certainly right about that. Made aware of the activities of the cult, Lex wrote a report recommending that the family be investigated for criminal activity. In late October, early November of 1989, he finally gets a phone call saying that he would be part of a task force to investigate and was given 3 months to clean things up. Little did he know it would take much longer. And in December of 1989, Task Force Operation Forest commences. Now, I can't really understand how it took nearly 2 years for an actual investigation into the cult to be granted, to try and find Anne and Bill, and to bring them to justice, especially because the raid had already happened, so they already knew the whole operation was dodgy. Just don't get it. So with little to no resources at first, Lex started with trying to find Anne, but he had no idea where she was. He was told she was in England or the United States, but she couldn't be located. Then, in 1990, the cult solicitor Peter Kibbe, who had left the group previously after an argument with Anne, was charged with perjury. However, he was told if he cooperated with the police in giving information about the family, that it might help him in the court proceedings. And you might be thinking, why would an intelligent solicitor get involved with such a group? Or any of these people, to be honest, but let's carry on. Well, Peter had a severe case of obsessive-compulsive disorder, and it would sometimes take him 2 to 3 hours to have a shower and 3 to 4 bars of soap, so he never got to the office on time. What did Anne do? Of course, she told him if he followed her and did everything that she wanted him to do, that she could cure him. So clearly this guy was desperate for any kind of help. At one point, she even arranged for him to have a lobotomy, which is like a surgery on the brain through the eye socket. However, his behaviour became strange after that, so I'm guessing it didn't work. It took police 3 months to gather information and statements just from Peter Kibbe because of the amount of information he had on the group. As well as Peter Kibbe, former auntie Patricia McFarlane also gave police information about adoption scams. So with all this information that Lex had gathered, he was then promoted to detective and given 12 months to close the case. After the raid, Anne and Bill had actually fled Australia and were on the run. And they were hard to track down, but finally in June of 1993, police from Australia, the UK and the US tracked them down to their property in the town of Hurleyville in the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York, which was a perfect hiding spot, which also happened to be an area full of religious cults. The FBI arrived at their Hurleyville home in the early hours of the morning to arrest them. They were taken to a US court and held in state prison for 3 months. Anne and Bill's attorneys made a full-throttle approach that they should be released on bail, that they were of no threat to the community, and that they had health issues. However, while in custody, one of Bill's cellmates was murdered, which scared Bill, and he decided that he had had enough. Much to the satisfaction of Lex DeMann, himself and 3 other police officers flew to the US to collect them. Finally, they had them. They were arrested and extradited back to Australia, where on the 17th of August 1993, they went straight to the magistrate's court. However, far from being put back in prison as they should have been, they were released with a $25,000 surety, which is like a form of security attached to the conditions of a person's bail. One of the former sect children, Roland Whitaker, an adult at the time, actually stood by the couple through the trial pleading their innocence, and Bill was so overjoyed with him that he promises Roland $50,000 in his will for being so loyal. After a long legal battle, only one remaining charge is left. One count of conspiracy to defraud and to commit perjury by falsely registering the births of 3 unrelated children as their own triplets. The Hamilton Burns plead guilty. 7 members of the family also pleaded guilty at Ringwood Magistrates Court in Melbourne of defrauding the Commonwealth and charged $195,000. On September the 26th, 1994, the verdict day arrives in County Court. Anne and Bill face up to 5 years in prison and a $60,000 fine. And this part will make your blood boil. The judge lets them off, stating the age of the couple, Anne being 72 at the time, their state of health, and the fact that they had already spent 3 months in an American prison. So, after all this, they only faced a measly $5,000 fine each. The system had completely failed and no justice had been served. After the verdict, Anne and Bill retreated to their home in Ferny Creek, where they continued to meet regularly with their remaining followers at Santankeeton Lodge. The police task force, Operation Forest, lasted 4 years and cost more than $500,000. 11 police officers worked full-time on the case. And you might be thinking, for what? Because what did they really achieve? Well, the issues of charging the Hamilton Burns laid in a few things. Lexter Mann said that they couldn't really bring the evidence to court, and apparently there was a number of reasons for that. Like, in the case of administering the LSD to children, they didn't actually have the drugs, so they couldn't be presented. There was also the concern about the impact to the children after so many years of being in captivity under this cult leader, and having to bring them into court to testify. Also, part of the agreement when you extradite people from another country is that you can't just slap them with further charges, which is another reason it was so hard to bring them to justice. Add to this that Anne never got her hands dirty. She had every one of her followers do everything for her. She always told people exactly what they had to do and when, keeping her hands relatively clean throughout the whole process. So what about the children? Yes, they were free, however, adjusting into a society they knew nothing about was, as you can imagine, extremely hard. Ben Shenton, who we spoke about before, had, as expected, extreme difficulties. He was just 15 years old when he was released into society, he says, with no social skills, a deep desire to be accepted, and no sporting ability that he could be used to fit in. Without these fundamental building blocks and his odd ways, he struggled to fit in and to make friends, and he sunk into a deep depression lasting a year, and says how he thought daily about how to end the torment. During a Year 11 school trip around Central Australia, he found himself completely excluded from the group and broke down in tears. He realised that life wasn't working and resolved to fill in the gaps in his emotional and social knowledge when he returned home. And by the time he was 18, he said he found the truth and a clear path. Unfortunately, most of the children were left with lasting psychological damage, as you would expect. In 2009, 2 of the cult's victims received compensation from Anne. In August of the same year, Sarah, one of the former children, and at that time an adult as well, suggested a reconciliation with Anne at one of the cult's houses in the Dandenong Ranges. Australian TV show 60 Minutes are there to film the whole thing. However, unsurprisingly, Anne denies any wrongdoing, saying that the children lied and that they were never beaten.
Of course they weren't.
Because?
They were not beaten.
Never.
Never. You'll have to be pretty good to see through that bullshit. It's absolute bullshit. It's lies.
Are you a monster?
Certainly not.
Are you evil?
Well, what do you call evil?
The systematic abuse of children is evil.
No.
Oh my god, how furious would you be that even at her age, she doesn't even acknowledge or apologise for what she put them through. That is just definition of pure evil. Sarah did sadly try and take her own life at one point. Her attempt wasn't successful, and she did go on to become a doctor helping children in India, though she died at the age of 46 of heart failure. And 46 is very young, and it makes me wonder if the drugs from her childhood, as well as the trauma of all those years, would have contributed to her early death. Finding the biological mothers of the children was also a lengthy and complicated process for the authorities. During the 1970s, 1 baby in 12 in Australia was born to a single mother, where adoption was seen as the solution. If the mother tried to question the notion of adoption, they were totally shut down and told they couldn't keep the child. If they tried to revoke the adoption, which some did, despite how many times, they were also ignored and the adoption still went ahead. In that time, especially if you were from a religious family, it was seen as a shame upon the family to have a child out of wedlock. One of the cult's children, whose mother birthed her, was made to sign a form to give her child up. She was given tranquilizers, and when the child was born, a pillow was put over her head so she couldn't see the baby being taken away. The police had to work with the adoption forms and cross-reference with blood samples and DNA to find some of the children's biological parents. Not an easy job with the amount of adoptions during that time. Other biological parents were, of course, some of the members who were aunties after Anne declared the children her own. So what happened to Anne and Bill, you might be thinking, because they basically got off scot-free. Well, Bill Byrne died of kidney failure in 2001. He had no gravestone due to the cult's motto of unseen, unheard, unknown. I'm wondering if that was more so no one would go spitting on the grave, to be honest. He left his entire estate to Anne, surprise, surprise. And if you remember, he did have 4 biological children with his ex-wife. Well, they were never mentioned in his will. And neither was the promised $50,000 to cult child Roland Whittaker, who stood by them in court. And what about Anne? Well, she was diagnosed with dementia, meaning that she couldn't face any more legal charges from the children of the cult. Also, 2 of her members were then granted power of attorney over her legal and financial affairs. Ben Shenton and his birth mother visited Anne in 2012 in a nursing home. Ben says that his mother Joy was still very worshipful towards her and still believed she saved her life and that she didn't believe the family was any kind of hoax. With everything that came out, the arrests, the court trials, news coverage, everything that went on, and she still had Anne up on this pedestal. It's just insane the amount of power that this woman had. Anne died at 97 years old in June of 2009 in a nursing home in suburban Melbourne. She never showed any remorse for her crimes. To add further insult, she had previously set up a charity under the name of Life for All Creatures, a charity for cats and dogs. But this was purely done so that when she did die, all of her assets were within this charity, meaning none of the children of the cult were able to access any money from her. Some of the family's cult members are still believed to be operational, although the group hasn't had any new members since the late 80s. The current members are now elderly, but are believed to be living off between $5 to $10 million between them, thanks to Anne's fraud and corruption. So that was some pretty heavy stuff. The amount of power that one woman commanded over so many is beyond words. And I think it also goes to show that evil is not always ugly. It can come wrapped unsuspectingly in beauty and glamour, which I think is sometimes more dangerous. I'm also still wondering what the driving motive was behind everything that she did. It appears to be money and power, but she was clearly massively mentally unstable and a psychopath, I'm guessing. What are your thoughts? Do you think Anne had spiritual and magical powers? Do you think her members were actually victims? I'd be interested to know what you guys think, so drop a comment down below. Well, that's it, but thanks so much for watching, guys, and if you did enjoy the video, please give it a like and don't forget to subscribe for more content. But for now, I'll see you guys in the next video.